Now, second lecture, Professor Iman Elsherif, Professor of Endocrinology, Suez Canal University. هتكلمنا عن inflammation in type 2 diabetes. اتفضلي استاذه ايمان.
صباح الخير جميعا، ازي حضراتكم؟ Good morning early birds. أنا اسمي إيمان الشريف. Good morning chairpersons. الحقيقة أنا بشكر بروفيسور إيناس شلتوت على إتاحة الفرصة لي إن أنا أكون موجودة سبيكر مع حضراتكم النهاردة. وقبل ما أبدأ كنت حابة إن أنا أقول لحضراتكم تشرفونا في الإسماعيلية إيفنت الورلد دايابيتس داي بالاشتراك مع العرب اسوشيشن فور ستادي اوف دايابيتس، كلية طب جامعة قناة السويس ونقابة الأطباء بالإسماعيلية. اللي حابب يقضي اليوم في الإسماعيلية طبعا يشرفنا ويحضر المحاضرات. هيبقى يوم الخميس 14، وفي شركات زي الإسراء وسانوفي بتوفر حضور ريجستريشن للأطباء الكرام، فحابة أشوف حضراتكم كلكم عندنا في الإسماعيلية إن شاء الله. Going back to our lecture، وأتعشم إنه الآي تي ما يحسبوش كل الرغي اللي فات ده من الوقت بتاعي. Okay, let's go. How many endocrinologists are there into the room? Okay, that's great. Is diabetes only an endocrinological disease? Okay, how many cardiologists are there? Is it only a vascular disease? Okay, two voices only. Type. The other audience, what do you think about diabetes? Is it endocrinological? It's vascular disease? Yes, it's a multifaceted disease, not yet well understood. Now in this lecture, we will tackle just one part of it. Inflammation in type 2 diabetes I will have a very concise agenda because the topic is a bit complicated. So, is it newly only known that inflammation is known into type 2 diabetes? What are the clinical parameters? How it's derived? And how it's derived is recently known in 2022. And if there targeted anti-inflammatory therapies used in type 2 diabetes? Not yet. Number one, when inflammation was early known in type 2 diabetes, as early as almost 125 years back. When Williamson, RT and 1901, noticed that sodium salicylate led to decreased glucosuria in patients with diabetes, لاحظوا إنه by that time no known insulin and no known anti-diabetic drugs. They were very desperate to know any drug that should lower the glucosuria. Late, about 50 years later, those authors noticed that the inhibition of serine kinase I-kappa beta, kinase beta, correlates with post-receptor action of insulin, and it caused hypoglycemia in patients who are suffering glycosuria. What happens then? All those studies, this idea kept dormant till 1993, when it had been shown in the Science journal that adipose expression of tumor necrosis factor alpha has direct relation with the insulin resistance in those with obesity. And we know very well that obesity, especially the truncal obesity, central obesity, is highly correlated with development of type 2 diabetes. And in this 1993 paper, it had been shown clearly that the role of TNF-alpha in obesity, and particularly in insulin resistance, is highly related to insulin resistance and diabetes, with insulin resistance, which is associated with obesity and type 2 diabetes. This was just observation, but no treatment was thought about by that time. What are the clinical parameters? The clinical parameters, almost 10 years later, in 2003, in Diabetes Journal, low-grade systemic inflammation and development of type 2 diabetes, a link had been shown, and it concluded that there is a low-grade inflammation more than 10 years earlier than the diagnosis of diabetes. And they studied the Bima Indians. Bima Indians دي ethnic group موجودة في الستيتس اللي هم من أمريكا اللاتينية، اللي هم الأصليين بتوع أمريكا. درسوهم لأن دول عندهم high prevalence of type 2 diabetes. درسوا ولادهم لقوا انه الانسولين resistance عندهم inflammatory markers 10 years or more earlier in the younger generations before they developed frank diabetes. ومن هنا جت الفكرة بتاعت ان هم to correlate different inflammatory markers as interleukin 6, CRB, sialic acid, fibrinogen, and they scored this inflammatory markers against some anthropometric measures, clinical measures, and some lab, and they found there are all of them has some sort of an increased inflammatory score and relation. And later, 14 years later, Ilulu from Malaysia, these are study groups from Malaysia, tried to categorize those inflammatory markers against the steps of overweight, obesity, to the type 2 diabetes. It starts with increased resistin, free fatty acids, TNF alpha, back again, افتكروا TNF alpha ده أول مرة يظهر في 1993, وlow adiponectin, and with the increase of weight, increase of insulin resistance, which is all the time there, increased inflammatory markers, interleukin 1 beta, interleukin 6, fibrinogen, haptoglobin, ending up in the frank dyslipidemia. Meanwhile, this patient with the insulin resistance and those inflammatory markers can develop cardiovascular disease, even type 2 diabetes is not yet diagnosed. That's why complications, macro complications of insulin resistance can present in patients who are not yet diagnosed as frank type 2 diabetes, because it's related to the inflammatory markers and to the insulin resistance underlying pathology. How is the inflammation derived? Inflammation derived had been in those in the work of the study group of 2017. They showed that adiponectin, the normal level of adiponectin, has effect of the brain because it affects the energy expenditure, promotes the beta cell survival, and decrease the glucose output and decrease lipogenesis. And if this decrease the adiponectin, if there is hypoadiponectinemia, all these effects are reversed. And lately in 2022, this is almost 2 years ago, it had been shown that the inflammatory interleukin 6 flux increase is go through the T helper 17 cells mediated inflammatory progression, which starts by the dietary sugar. Dietary sugar, مجرد السكر اللي بناخده في الأكل, goes into the mitochondria, disease the mitochondria, make it release reactive oxygen species. Through a complicated cascade, it results in the inflammatory 6 release. And this is another diagram from the same paper showing it clearly how just the dietary sugars can result in inflammatory release, plethora of inflammatory release. So when we say diet control and exercise, it works very well. This is correlating both the pathology to the immune response, which is sustained when the patient is all the time under the inflammatory response. But if there are anti-inflammatory therapies, remember, it has been in 2023, published almost 18 months ago, about the some anti-inflammatory drugs. First, some of these drugs are available in the market. They are used in the treatment of, for example, of rheumatoid arthritis, psoriasis, some sort of those inflammatory immunological disease. The anacarnira, a recombinant human interleukin 1 beta receptor antagonist, it had been shown to decrease the level of A1C and improve the glycemic control, and reduce the blood levels of the interleukin 6 and CRB. Unfortunately, these levels were not sustained more than 48 months, almost 1 year. After 1 year, it has no effect. So, نشوف drug تاني. فاكرين 1993 لما قالوا TNF alpha? Okay, TNF alpha receptor, it showed, sorry, it can diminish the glucose dependent insulin secretion, but اللي هو الاتونورسبت, لكن it has no effect on the chemical parameters, the fasting and the A1C. So if both are not working, let's mix them together. So this drug had been a mix of both, and mixing both of them can reduce the A1C. It can play a role in insulin secretion, but at higher doses. But it has no effect on CRB. And patients with longer diabetes duration in the study of this drug, where all of them were taking metformin, renin blockade drugs, statins. All those drugs are well established to have anti-inflammatory role. So there is no clear role for the anti-inflammatory drug in those cases. Another drug, remember from 1901 when the scientists Williamson reported that the salicylic acid make the hypoglycemia and decrease the glucosuria. They tried it, but unfortunately, after 1 year of treatment, it didn't have any effect on the inflammatory markers. And so, though some results are promising, and this is a compilation of all the studies with all the drugs, you can see here that we need larger doses. For example, it's neither of these studies exceeded 1 year, only this one, and all of them except this one only had very smaller number of investigees. The age is not the age group. Not all age groups were expressed on those studies. Male sex was prevalent, and so those results, though they are promising, yet they cannot be extrapolated on a larger base to be used to advocate for using anti-inflammatory drugs regularly in type 2 diabetes. And to conclude, yes, type 2 diabetes is endocrinological, vascular, inflammatory, and more to come. A multifaceted disease. Anti-inflammatory drugs show promising results, yet only healthy diets, especially NASH and Mediterranean, also exercise, have the class 1A preventive measures against overweight and insulin resistance and inflammation. This had been clearly shown in Professor Peter Schwartz's lecture yesterday. And here I come to the end of my lecture. Thank you all.
شكرا دكتورة إيمان على المحاضرة الدسمة جدا دي. وكنا نتمنى يبقى في وقت عشان نتناقش، لكن for the sake of time احنا هننهي الجلسة ونطلب الجلسة اللي بعديها بس. شكرا جزيلا على المحاضرة الجميلة قوي.
شكرا.